Gender and climate change. Climate change. Climate change has a greater impact on those sections of the population in all countries that are most reliant on natural resources for their livelihoods and or who have the least capacity to respond to natural hazards such as drought, landslides, floods, and hurricanes. Gender. Women commonly face higher risks and greater burdens from the impacts of climate change in situations of poverty, and the majority of the world's poor are women. Women's unequal participation in decision making processes and labor markets compound inequalities and often prevent women from fully contributing to climate related planning, policy making, and implementation. Women in developing countries are particularly vulnerable to climate change because they are one, highly dependent on local natural resources for their livelihoods. Women's roles in the household include securing water, food, and fuel for cooking and heating. Women also bear the burden of fetching water for their families and spend significant amounts of time daily hauling water from distant sources. Water from distant sources is rarely enough to meet the needs of the household and is often contaminated, such that women and girls also pay the heaviest price for poor sanitation. Time spent looking for such resources also affects their priorities. Time could be used better in order to find employment or education. Women experience unequal access to resources and decision making processes with limited mobility in rural areas. Socio-cultural norms can limit women from acquiring the information and skills necessary to escape or avoid hazards, such as swimming and climbing trees to escape rising water levels. Furthermore, dress codes imposed on women can restrict their mobility in times of disaster. Women often take responsibility for small children and elders who cannot swim or run. Why it's significant. In developing countries, social structures that disadvantage women often put them at a higher risk of harm and even death from climate change. For example, because women are frequently responsible for caring for children and the elderly, they're often the last to leave when a disaster strikes. A 2007 study from the London School of Economics found that natural disasters, which are expected to become more severe as the world heats up, are more likely to kill women than men, and that this disparity is largest where women's socioeconomic status is lowest. Vulnerability of women. Post disaster, women are usually at higher risk of being placed in unsafe, overcrowded shelters due to lack of assets such as savings, property, or land. In the context of cyclones, floods, and other disasters that require mobility, cultural constraints on women's movements may hinder their timely escape, access to shelter, or access to healthcare. Poor women, and those in countries of higher gender inequality, appear to be at the highest risk. A direct correlation has been observed between women's status in society and their likelihood of receiving adequate health care in times of disaster and environmental stress. Africa. In 63% of households in rural sub Saharan Africa, for example, women must collect and carry the family's water according to a 2010 United Nations report. In only 11% of households does this job fall to men. South Asia. In the Mugu district of mountainous northwest Nepal, warmer weather is threatening the food supply, a burden that is largely falling on women. Several feet of snow used to cover the ground during the winter months, making the tough terrain easier for the Mughal community to plow in spring. With much less snow and even winter rains, a new phenomenon, crop production has dropped and traditional underground food storage methods are failing. Asia Pacific. During the past decade, in the Asia Pacific region, an annual average of more than 200 million was affected and more than 70,000 people were killed by natural disasters. 90% and 65% respectively of the global total for natural disasters. Women and children make up the majority of deaths resulting from water related disasters.